Welcome to this part 2 in this, so we say, mini-series having to do with global heating or climate change and municipalities. I live in semi-detached housing, so I have a neighboring house right beside me, and somebody's moving in there and doing some kind of renovation today. But I'm on a bit of a tight schedule. I need to be done before the end of January with this recording. So therefore there might be some noise in the background, which I hope you can put up with. Maybe that just goes to show that this is real and it wasn't done by some sort of AI. Why would an AI add in such kind of, shall we call it, an imperfection? Before I talk more about climate change per se, I'd like to put much of the rest of this presentation in a context. And the context is what is, I'm not the only one, but I'm bringing up what is called the urban environmental transition. And we can see where this term was used in the past, where it was sort of first coined. This is based on an observation of, if you have poorer locations, they're calling them settlements, and we have more wealthy locations or settlements. And of course, what is poor and what is wealthy during a given snapshot in time, then there are places in the world that are poorer and more wealthy than others. That we also have a time position here. If we think of a city, shall we say, in Europe in the 1800s, compared to now, maybe that city was relatively poor, but the city has become relatively wealthy. We could have any other kind of place in the world. So it's not just a geographic location or an economic location, it's also that there's a tendency to become wealthier through time as the standard of living rise. So we have some curves that link to each other. This is sometimes referred to as a sort of an upside-down Kuznets curve, borrowing from economics. We see here that increasing severity of a problem and increasing wealth. So what kind of problems are there when a city is relatively poor? The local burdens are what are prioritized. For example, indoor air pollution, that you have a number of people that have wood-burning stoves or other kinds of air pollution, potentially problems, or they're burning something actually indoors with poor ventilation for cooking and for heating. They're not going to be concerned about other kinds of problems other than the local problems which have an immediate impact on health, the health of the inhabitants in the city. Then we come to, we shift towards, as we get richer, we start thinking not just about the local, we start thinking about burdens which are taking place in the city, but also in the region around the city. So we move to maybe, say, the ambient air quality. We're concerned about pollution which comes in the city from other locations. Or we start to consider the people outside of the city, if we've built higher chimneys or smokestacks, that they're getting some of this air pollution. And then as the city gets richer and richer, then we start to think about global burdens. For example, emissions of so-called greenhouse gases to the air, which leads to a global problem. So we have shifting concerns here from the local to the immediate threat of health, moving in the direction of the global, and that things are maybe delayed, and then life-supporting systems around the planet are affected instead. And it's not the case that you have somebody in a poor country in the global south now, maybe in a poor neighborhood. It may be that they are actually aware of some of this, but their concerns, of course, are here. They're more concerned with vaccination, perhaps of themselves and other people in their community, and they're more concerned maybe about illumination at night indoors so that children can read their course books and do better in school, so the next generation can do better and have a better life than the generation of the parents that is sacrificing for the future generation. Almost like sustainability, thinking about future generations. And yes, where's the electricity coming from? Maybe it's a coal-powered fuel plant. That is, of course, causing some of these problems, but as long as the coal-fired power plant is at some distance in the city, then I and my children are not having problems, so let's just have some electricity at night so that they can read the school books at night and excel in school. And we see this, that the environmental concerns, not just of citizens, inhabitants in a city, but also decision makers in a city, and to the extent that they have them, there is a tendency to move in these directions. It's not so surprising that perhaps that certain environmental issues, it takes some time until the city is wealthy enough before there is enough concern in that area. This isn't to say that now everyone is only concerned about the various planetary boundaries, where global heating is one of those. There are still local concerns that are left to be addressed in a number of locations around the world, in seemingly rich cities as well. An environmental problem that occurs often and is often ignored is noise, a human health problem in and around cities. So, I'd like to continue talking about global heating and change in climate, and I'll just use the example of temperature. We could have changes in precipitation if you'd like instead, but we'll just deal with temperature here. Let's look at a typical year in a particular place in the world. It doesn't matter exactly where it is. We will look at this sort of curve that has this blue underneath it here. What we see here is that for many places in the world we have what we could call average temperatures throughout the year. It's not so cold, it's not so hot. The probability of occurrence of having temperatures is probably very strong there. We have a mean temperature of the year, 15 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Celsius, what kind of number it is. And so what we have is we have periods of time during the year from this presumed normal distribution here, where there are some days of the year which are quite cold. Somebody else, some other place that has a colder climate, might not think that that was all that cold, but you might think it's cold. And the same thing here, that we have hot weather that occurs during certain periods of the year. There aren't very many days that are hot, there aren't very many days that are cold, there are these sort of average here. And everything is dependent upon the location. Presuming that you're living in your city and it's a place where it's not an extreme climate to begin with. What happens when we have human-induced global heating? We have the local scale changes in both weather and climate. And during a yearly basis, which we can start thinking about a climate, whereas weather is something which is much more momentary, we can see that perhaps in a particular location that global heating at a global level will lead to climate change locally or at a regional level. And this would change the temperature. We have this previous distribution here, and then there's a shift. There's an increase in the mean temperature which is starting to take place. Let's look a little more closely at this. So everything has been shifted over. So what was in the past an average temperature but a bit warm, that becomes the new mean, the new climate, the new normal. Everything is shifted over. So we're still experiencing hot weather, and now we're occasionally experiencing periods of time with record hot weather. It's never been this hot before, and it's never been this hot before for such a prolonged period of time. In the past, maybe we had a day it was that hot, and now we're having weeks on end that it's that hot. And we also have less and less cold weather. We might have the occasional day that still sort of slips into what was considered cold weather before, and then it'll become considered unseasonably cold weather. It was normal before, but now is no longer normal. This is assuming, in this sort of simplification here, that everything is just an increase in the mean. Everything is shifted over by a few degrees, and that might occur in some places. What about if we have another kind of climate change, when it isn't the mean that changes, but we have a shift in variance? This was the old climate here that we could see demonstrated by this, that we have record cold weather and we have record hot weather. Suppose that there's a change in variance. There's less variation in the temperature. The mean is still the same. Or let's say there's let's say there's an increase in variation. The mean is still the same here, but what we now have is we have periods of time during the year when the weather is colder than it's ever been before and the weather is hotter than it's ever been before. That's not the climate future most of us are looking for or will experience in the future. But what we can do is we could switch between cities in the world and see how this might play out. They have a particular place that has the same mean temperature on a yearly basis, maybe located as far south as another city, as far north as another city, but you go from a maritime climate to a continental climate, and in a continental climate there's an increase in variance. So for example, if we have some cities in Scotland or northern England, that they would have this kind of a curve like that. But if we move to the interior of the continent, if we would move to, shall we say, Moscow, being about as far north, perhaps having a similar kind of meaning temperature, we have much greater variation. We have very much colder times of the year in the winter times and very much hotter summers than would be experienced in, say, Scotland and parts of northern England, where because of so much of the sea, the North Sea of the Atlantic, the temperatures are more moderated. So we can see the effect of climate change as a sort of a thought experiment. If we move from one place in the world which has a particular kind of climate to another place that has the same mean temperature but has an increased variance in temperature, we can sort of play as this an experiment to think about what we might experience in the future if that was what was the change in climate. And as I said, we're probably not going to see so much of this in a given location. However, what happens if we increase the mean and we increase the variance? That's the next slide. If we increase the mean and we increase the variance, which is something which might occur in some locations, we have the old climate with the distribution of temperature, a few cold days, most days that are sort of average, a few hot days. I'm talking about the average. But now we have a new climate where the mean has shifted in this direction to warmer and there's more variance. That means the curve has flattened out a bit as opposed to having this sort of peak, more this bell-shaped curve in the middle. So we are on average going, on a typical year, we're not going to get very much cold weather, but we'll occasionally get some days where it'll be cold. So for those of you in Malmö, for example, my students, with climate change, global heating in the future, on an average level, assuming that there's no drastic change in the so-called Gulf Stream or the North Atlantic Current, yes, a city like Malmö will warm up. But we will still have some days in the wintertime in the future during the next 50 years where there'll be some snow, less and less common, and the snow might melt very quickly. So somebody who says in the future, oh look, it's snowing, that means there's no global heating. That's confusing the weather on a particular day for the climate. And then what we'll have is what we used to consider would be days that were hot. They're starting to become normal. They're sort of a bit beyond the old, they're definitely beyond the old average, but now they're part of the new climate, normal. But unheard of hot weather is now something which is starting to occur more and more often, and we have longer and long periods of weather which we say is record hot weather. So at your location, wherever you're watching this in the world, what's going to happen? Which one of these diagrams is going to be the case for you? Are you going to just have an increase in mean? Or are you going to have an increase in mean in variance? Which one is it going to be? If you are not from a particular location and you're investigating a climate change action plan on the part of a city in some other place in the world, it might be difficult to make a critical assessment of that plan without knowing this, based on climate modeling that occurs. That might make it difficult to be able to assess how well you believe or your informed opinion is about that city's climate change action plan. On the other hand, there could be things that you could look at to see how the city addresses problems in general. So, continuing on the idea of temperatures and temperature change. We'll be getting to urban heat island effect in a moment. It's impossible to know a climate future for a particular place unless you've really dug deep into the studies that have done in that region or that specific location. We have weather forecasts, and most weather forecasts are reasonably accurate a number of days into the future, and then they become increasingly inaccurate, or they have to be increasingly qualitative and vague. We can't say that it's the end of January, we can't say that the 17th of May, where I am, is going to be 27 degrees Celsius. I mean, we could say that, but we're probably not going to be right. We could perhaps say that based on current atmospheric trends and global shifts in patterns of low pressures and high pressures and so forth, we might say that May 2025 is going to be wetter than normal. That's a kind of a weather forecast, but it's not a specific day and specific numbers. And we have in the climate these sort of long-term changes, and weather can be sort of like little blips in the trend. We can have specific days where the weather is a bit different than is expected. And there's enough diversity in the short term. And there's a lot of uncertainty. We have our various kinds of emission scenarios that sort of feed into the IPCC studies. If we think about, there could be political changes, that you get a new government, or you get some sort of autocratic or quasi-autocratic president, or something like that, someplace. And you're going to have a lot more emissions of carbon dioxide and a lot more emissions of methane than otherwise that would be occurring, as opposed to if you had a more environmentally progressive kind of government. You can't know this in the climate models. You could, of course, make a series of predictions and say that's our scenario for what society is going to do, and then we get these kinds of emissions. There's also the idea of climate sensitivity. How much is the climate going to be sensitive to changes in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? And there are assumptions in the models about this, the emission scenarios and the climate sensitivity. This means that there is some kind of uncertainty. We do understand that the planet as a whole is going to warm up. And a warmer planet means a more active hydrologic cycle. Globally speaking, there's going to be more moisture in the air, which means that some places are going to get more precipitation and more powerful cloudbursts than they were getting before. At the same time, you could have some places, even if the global amount of humidity is going to increase, we could have some places that locally have less moisture in the air, more likely to get a drought. So there's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the city preparing for? We have to weigh some uncertainty with understanding that we have to make some kind of preparations. We have to start to make certain decisions now so that we're better prepared for a climate in the future. The increase in mean, the increase in variance, whatever that would be, and that was just temperatures. Some cities need to start preparing themselves for a sea level rise. Other cities need to start preparing themselves for flooding, that you could have a cloudburst, in other words, sudden tremendous amounts of rain, and maybe that for several days. Where's the water going to flow in the city, if not onto the streets and into the basements of buildings and so forth? What happens if you have a cloudburst upstream and suddenly the river floods and the low-lying parts of the city are completely flooded out? The city may be subjected to prolonged periods of heat, or just heat, and or drought. The city might be affected by high winds. This is going to make this video slightly dated. It's January 2025, at the beginning of January 2025, in some of the metropolitan area of Los Angeles in California in the United States. There were a series of fires that took place that destroyed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of buildings. And California had experienced periods of drought in the past, and then the drought ended seemingly, and then there was an above average amount of precipitation for a while, and vegetation just grew a lot, and then there were drought conditions that took over again. So you have a lot more dry vegetation just ready for some sort of a spark to take place. And fires started in the metropolitan Los Angeles area in the beginning of January, or maybe it's the end of December, that period of time. And this was coupled with a long period of strong high winds, which are usually referred to the Santa Ana winds. And so we can see, in most likelihood, some of these fires were in part caused by global heating because of the prolonged drought, but there may be no connection between the high winds and global heating. You would need to have that connection to say, yes, this was all entirely caused by global heating. What else might we be preparing for in the city itself? Preparing to adapt to specific threats with specific resilience, or do we have a general resilience where we're trying to enhance the resilience of everyone in the city? Here we see, I tried to find a picture someplace. It's a rather stupid picture. If we ignore the window here, we could make that a solid wall, and we could imagine that the sea is in that direction. And so somebody has built something to sort of protect their building against crashing waves. Of course, having glass windows all the way floor to ceiling on the first floor seems a little dumb there, if that's what you're worried about. Maybe you don't want to have all that many windows there that are going to break. Maybe you want to have a solid wall there and just have glass at the top there. Anyway, what kind of resilience are we thinking about, and how could this be related to system thinking? There are ideas about resilience, and in some climate change plans that you can read in cities, that one of the words that you read a lot is the word resilience. But the resilience they're talking about is usually very specific resilience. They're not making people and organizations in the city generally more resilient. The idea of resilience has a tendency to think about making things tougher as opposed to making things more nimble. We can have a monolithic wall. That's something that is protecting us against some very specific threat. And that might be something we need, but it might not be enough. And if we prepare the organizations and inhabitants of our city for a climate change in the future, then that's making them tougher, but it's also making them more nimble, more agile in the face of problems. So the sort of metaphors we can think of is the specific resilience is a monolithic wall, but the more nimble kind of resilience is a Boxster. And we might need to change the system and our relations to the system, the system being the city and its infrastructure and the inhabitants and the various organizations in the city. Instead of tweaking what we have, maybe we need to change the system itself. How about that? Could that be possible? There isn't much thought going many times into going to making the organizations and the inhabitants in the city more nimble, agile, and resourceful in face of adversity when climate changes in the future. So the kind of resilience, if we're going to think about a metaphor for the resilience in many cities, it's a monolithic wall. We're going to wall off parts of the city if it's sea level rise or flooding. But it's not talked about as much about being nimble and making organizations and people better prepared. That's at least my experience. That could be, if we have a metaphor of the monolithic wall, this means that we're tweaking what we already have in the city. And that what we already have in the city in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the decision making, in terms of the inhabitants, the organizations, and so forth. That's our system. And building the monolithic wall is a way to tweak what we already have, to make slight changes in it. Maybe the system itself needs to change. Heavens, maybe we need to move the city. Instead, if we think about being more nimble but also being tough, a better metaphor would be being a boxer. So they're punching, they're going at each other, and they're holding up their arms to protect themselves from getting hit. But they're also me, a boxer, that sounds ridiculous. But besides they're doing this, the tough part, they're nimble. If necessary, they take a few steps back. They move to another location in the ring. So it's this movement around being nimble, instead of standing in one place and being the tough monolith and just getting hit over and over and again and protecting yourself from that. It would make sense to maybe move to dodge a blow from time to time. Maybe that would make some sense. But no, we're just going to build big monoliths. So we see in this case, this person here seems to be, in preparation for this blow coming, is getting ready to duck and move out of the way. Yeah, we can see they're moving around and they're trying to be tough. And at the same time, being tough involves being that I need to step to the side because I can't block that blow. But if the cities are just building monolithic walls, then they're not improving the agility and nimbleness of the inhabitants and the organizations and their own decision-making processes. Another matter when it comes to adaptation to climate change is the idea of fairness. There are a number of academic books that have been written about this, and some of them are quite old. So some of the more new ones maybe build upon some of the older ones, but fairness hasn't changed there. People in the global south, they're more likely to be hit by climate change. Globally, poorer people are going to have more problems when it comes to global heating. We probably consider this to be correct. I mean, if you're somebody living in a city or a town on the coast of Bangladesh or on some of the river waterways in Bangladesh, you might be in big trouble. Or if you're living in a city in Latin America or Africa or South America, perhaps I should say, close to the equator and temperatures are rising and that it's getting drier and precipitation is less reliable. Your housing is a problem. You're getting too hot in your home and you feel like there's nothing you can do about this. And you feel like you're stuck in the city and you can't go anywhere else. Well, so if we consider this to be the case globally, could it be the case in specific locations? Of course it could be, but that's not talked about so much. Each city, anywhere in the world, is going to have people and organizations that are going to be afflicted more by climate change than other people and other organizations in the city. Just like globally, we have the global south and we have a global north, where are big distinctions there. Of course, we could have countries which have places which are both, can be socioeconomically considered the global north and the global south in one. So when it comes to adaptation to climate change with these words like resilience, there are other words, exposure, sensitivity, and vulnerability, which I'm going to talk about more. Let's have a scenario of massive cloudbursts, like the kind that affected Copenhagen a number of years ago. And at the time there were people in and around Malmö, just across the sound from Copenhagen, who looked at how Copenhagen was afflicted by this and all the servers in the bottom of the basement. And some of these people said, these Swedes said, oh, those Danes, they're just so unprepared. But within a few years, Malmö was afflicted by cloudbursts. It wasn't as dramatic as the cloudbursts which hit Copenhagen, but the inner ring road was completely flooded out, stopping bus traffic, and there were pictures of people being evacuated out of buses onto boats. Maybe the Swedes weren't as clever. Maybe what the Swedes need to do, instead of saying about the Danes, maybe they need to learn from a neighboring city's experience and start planning accordingly. I'm not sure that really occurred. I think there are plenty of examples in Malmö where the city is not preparing for climate change and human-induced global heating impacting the city locally. And we'll see if there's time to show one or two slides about that. So with the massive cloudbursts, we're going to have a lot of flooding during short time periods. But we'll move from Copenhagen and Malmö, we'll move to, I don't know, a favela in Brazil, wherever else. We can imagine that the poor people in the city are more likely to live on the slopes, where there's a risk for erosion, and it's difficult to build to begin with. Or they'll be located perhaps on the floodplain, because no one otherwise wants to build there. Rich people are less likely to live on those slopes or on the floodplain. Of course, if you're very rich, maybe you've built on those slopes because you've had somebody who's reinforced the erosion-prone slope. But we see otherwise that the poor are exposed to massive cloudbursts and flooding because of their location, and their location in part is determined by their poverty or perhaps their ethnicity. The two could be combined together. The rich are less likely to be exposed to climate change effects. So unfairness in economic distribution within society will become compounded when we have weather events that are linked to climate change. Once exposed, the poor are going to have fewer resources to recover. The rich, once exposed, have more resources to recover. They might be able to pay to rebuild the house on the slope or the floodplain, or they have enough money to move elsewhere and just write off the loss of the building and just walk away from that. The rich people have more resources to protect themselves in the equivalent kind of urban environment that is exposed. So the rich are less sensitive to the same kind of recovery, to the same kind of exposure. They can more easily recover, and they can more easily prevent or reduce the effects of their exposure. That makes them less vulnerable. So here are some pictures showing the poor versus the rich, and we can see here some city here with maybe rich people living there and poor people living there, and sometimes we can see a drastic shift there. And here we can see perhaps going up the slopes there, substandard housing that's just sort of been built, and people are squatting on the land and they don't have any title for the land, but they have to live close enough to the center of the city to be able to take public transport to be able to reach their job, their low-paying job. That was about cloudbursts and flooding. How about another scenario? Hot periods of the year become longer and hotter. The poor have poorer living conditions than the rich. They're more exposed because of the buildings and where they live in the city. They have fewer opportunities to cool off. Their health to begin with, because they're poor, might be poor, which means that they are both more exposed and they're more sensitive to the heat. The rich, on the other hand, they can afford to rebuild their residences. They can drive to and from work in an air-conditioned car. They can afford higher energy bills for running more air conditioners. So the rich are less exposed to the heat, and they can absorb economic challenges. They are less sensitive. So even with this other kind of scenario likely to occur in some places in the world because of human-induced global heating, we can see how the rich are probably going to do much better than the poor. That this distinction in economic advantage will become exacerbated in some places in the world because of climate change. So vulnerability equals exposure and sensitivity. And this is something which disaster management practice and studies is very clear on. And climate disasters, like we're talking about here, even though we could predict them, and even though we might be able to prevent some of them, flooding or creeping along like long-term enhanced urban heat island and so forth, these are climate disasters that are occurring or just waiting to occur. But if we approach them solely from the monolithic wall perspective and working with exposure and ignore sensitivity, that means that people will remain vulnerable, at least some people will remain vulnerable. And some, not only people, but some organizations, including some businesses, will remain vulnerable. So resilience is probably higher among those that have more economic and social resources. However, we can't just sort of say that everyone who's rich and everyone who's poor and so forth is going to be like this with the resilience. Even among the poor and less educated, some resilience may still be possible. This kind of discussion and happening when it comes to resilience, exposure, sensitivity, and vulnerability, this kind of problem, this could never occur in a rich city like Malmö in Sweden. I'm saying that to members of the audience, students in the course who maybe live in Malmö, who might be thinking about climate change problems as something which takes place someplace else. An incredibly naive kind of perspective. Come on, wake up. Let's think of these kinds of situations here. We have Tant Adga, we could call her in English Granny Adga. She lives alone in a small house. Her partner passed away a few years ago. Tant Adga, Granny Adga, she has a garden. Okay, there's a place for a car, but there's a garden there, and she has a small pond, and she has, I don't know, she watches the birds coming to her pond from time to time. She might have a dog, she might have a cat, like that. Her retirement, her pension, permits some limited rebuilding of her house. She can afford to buy and run air conditioning in her bedroom and her living room. So she has 2 rooms that she can be relatively cool during the hot days of the summer. Hot days of the summer in Malmö, oh, just you wait. Urban heat island effect, perhaps, and so forth, and a decade from now. But then we have poor Tant Berit, Granny Berit. She lives alone. Notice, Adga lives alone, Berit lives alone. She lives in a small apartment or flat, and all the windows face south. So at night and during the day, there is no air movement east to west in her apartment. If her apartment had been designed and located in such a way in the building so that there were different directions, there would always be a room that might be a little cooler and that she could open windows and there could be a breeze, and maybe she could have a fan that could blow the air through the house. And the only one who can modify the building that could make changes that would help her, that would redesign the building, is the landlord. And the landlord might be only interested in money. And Tant Berit, because, and so forth, she can't afford to buy and run a portable air conditioner in her little apartment. This is my scenario here. So this kind of resilience, exposure, sensitivity, and vulnerability, this problem could never occur in a rich city like Malmö. No, 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 that would never happen. And if you think that, how naive you are. Replace Malmö with another kind of city in a country which has for decades been socially and economically progressive. Let's switch. Instead of Granny Tant, we'll have Uncle Anders, Farbror Anders, a term that's sometimes used to address somebody and you don't know who the male is. You can call this person Uncle, Farbror Anders. And then you could have the word Tant for describe Adga and Berit. So instead we have Farbror Anders, all of these uncles, all these grandfathers, they live in an apartment building someplace in Malmö. And Anders, where he lives, one of his adult sons and daughters lives in Malmö and visits him once a week during the hot weeks in the summer. And Anders, there are a group of retirees in the building that get together from time to time. And he knows a handful of people who are not retirees in his building. That there are some students at Malmö University in his building. And some of these students, they don't just think about sustainability in future generations. They think about sustainability here and now, and they look after their elderly neighbor and wonder what's going on with this person. And they don't just let Anders know that I'm going to have a party on Friday, so it might be a little loud to about midnight, but then it'll be quiet because I know you need to get some sleep. They also think about being neighborly as a part of sustainability. And other people, families with children and small children. Then we have Farbror Bengt. He doesn't have any relatives living in Malmö at all. And the relatives he has, his adult sons and daughters, visit him 3 or 4 times during the year. Maybe he never gets a visit during the hot summer months because all the family is off on the beach someplace. He's not active with any of the other retirees in the building. He knows essentially no one else in his building. We could view it that maybe he could be less retiring, but maybe he needs to have people that sort of invite him into some sort of a social circumstance. Okay, these are, we'll consider them to be ethnic Swedes. They're part of the majority population in the city. And we could imagine that in some cities in the world that there could be ethnic groups which are more sensitive or more exposed to climate change in the future. But here's the twist. We have another person living in an apartment building in Malmö. We have Farbo Mohammed, Uncle Mohammed. 3 of his adult sons and daughters live in Malmö, and among his adult sons and daughters, they always make sure that at least one of them visits him once a day. Sometimes with other members of that family, visit him once a day. And there's a local cafe, and he's active with a group of people who meet daily at the local cafe. They play backgammon and chess, and they talk about events or whatever it is they do like that. So there's a lot of what we could call social capital that Mohammed has that Bengt doesn't have and Anders has a bit of. In part because Anders makes sure that he's socially involved. I mean, Bengt might have tried to become socially involved, but since no one was receptive and lended him a hand, so to speak, then he is lonely because there's no community for him. Anders tried to make sure he had a community, and the people around him were responsive to that, so he's part of a community. And Mohammed knows at least a dozen people who live in his apartment building. I mean, imagine the social capital. It's hot. Besides your family members who come to visit you, one of your neighbors thinks that Anders or Bengt or Mohammed, like that, gee, that old man there, maybe somebody needs to visit him and remind him to drink some water. Maybe I should invite him into my apartment and make sure I'm looking after him. And maybe I need to call one of his sons or daughters and say, he's in my apartment, he's okay, but you should probably come and look after him. Like that. Yeah. But this kind of questions about exposure, sensitivity, and vulnerability, where we look at social capital, economic capital, resilience, exposure, and sensitivity, and thus vulnerability. This could never occur in a rich city like Malmö, where we're so environmentally progressive, and maybe socially progressive, and so forth. No, absolutely not. It can't be the responsibility of individual people to look after their neighbors. No, that's not something which I could ever imagine doing, because I'm just going to look at my screen instead. I get a lot out of using social media as opposed to meeting people IRL. So when it comes to the ethics of climate change adaptation, we're used to at least talking about, and when it comes to sustainability, we're used to talking about and thinking about intergenerational justice. And this is the new part of an otherwise rather anthropocentric ethics when it comes to sustainability. But we also talk about intragenerational justice. The intergenerational justice is from one generation to another. The intragenerational justice is within those that are living today, regardless of their age, and so forth. When it comes to climate change, well, of course, we should think about future generations, and I'm going to make an assumption here. I'm pointing to you. The younger you are, the more you might be thinking about yourself, since you are the most recent future generation, so to speak. You will be a future generation at some point in time. Some of us are an older future generation. We have done certain things in the past, maybe not enough, but some of us have tried to do certain things, and now we have a new future generation. If they can always stop using social media less, then maybe they can consider their situation here. So thinking about people alive today in the near future in 5 years, who will be affected and why? What about helping specific people with specific problems? What about an overview of society? Why will certain people be more afflicted? And why will certain organizations be more afflicted? And is there some sort of systemic unfairness in the city? I've touched upon some issues. You might want to reflect upon this and think about other issues that might reflect upon some sort of systemic unfairness in the city that you live in. From a justice perspective, climate change adaptation plans and actions should focus, at least from a just and ethics perspective, should focus on those inhabitants and those organizations that are least able to adapt. They're the most exposed and the most sensitive and thus most vulnerable. If you examine a city climate change action plan, is that something you'll find in a document like that? An argument could be made instead that the most valuable in the city are the people and organizations that have the most valuable property, because that'll be the most economic loss. So we need to protect the most valuable locations and the most valuable people. A very cynical and perhaps unethical way of viewing this. Again, because the richest people, the richest organizations, even if they're exposed, they're the least sensitive, and therefore they're not among the most vulnerable. Maybe they need to help start paying a tax. Maybe corporate taxes need to increase. There needs to be some sort of corporate taxation in the city to help pay for reducing those organizations and the people employed in those organizations to their exposure. But no, we're not going to let that happen. We've moved to the city because of low taxes to begin with. The port of Houston, Texas, where there are a lot of refineries, oil refineries, and the logistics for petroleum, there might be a seawall built by the city itself to protect this valuable part of the city. They could extend it further away to protect perhaps vulnerable communities of people, but that's not in the city's plans. Doesn't seem like there's much of a justice perspective there. So who might be more vulnerable, more exposed, and more sensitive? Well, we already understand about poverty, or at least being relatively poor, and that's a relative definition there. People who might be less well educated, perhaps. Minorities. Women might be included in this. Children and an elderly. Children and an elderly, when it comes to heat, have greater difficulties regulating their body temperature, and they're less likely to realize that they're being affected by heat stroke. So if we looked at those inhabitants, but also those organizations in the city that are least able to adapt because they're most sensitive and most exposed and most vulnerable, maybe we need to put these kind of people and these kinds of organizations in the center of our climate change action plan for our city, at least when it comes to adaptation. Could be an idea. Maybe not all that likely that you're going to find lots of climate change action plans emphasizing adaptation, which are going to be thinking along these lines. Usually it's physical infrastructure, city planning around that infrastructure, and the economic losses of the city, which tend to be the central kind of discussion in those kinds of documents. There always are exceptions, and some cities might start to learn or might start to be informed by this way of thinking. And those of you listening to this lecture might take it to heart, and if you're working in a city, you might actually include that in your work, if you could, or convince other people about that. So this has been a lot about cities and climate change adaptation. Could we see parallels with a city when it comes to companies? Are there some principles that could help a company formulate a plan for climate adaptation and have that be more than just about logistics of the buildings that the company owns and rents? What about, just an example, the idea of corporate social responsibility and relations to the surrounding community where climate adaptation might be necessary? By working to make sure that logistics will be easier for your company, that might mean that people that live in the surrounding area, the logistics, the roads, the rail infrastructure is less likely to be affected by climate change, which indirectly means that you're doing some kind of responsibility thinking about the surroundings. If we think about sustainability reporting according to, for example, the CSRD. Companies also, just like I was talking about Singapore as a city-state, many companies are relying on certain supplies from distant locations. What happens if that logistics is ruined, that the ship with the parts sinks, or the factory in some distant location that you were buying things from is all flooded out? maybe you should think about the value chain, and maybe you should change your suppliers accordingly. Imagine if you wanted to climate adapt your company and think about the supply chain of supplies and goods and services on the way in. If those organizations are climate proofing themselves, then that helps you become more climate proof as well. When it comes to adaptation to coming climate change, municipalities, local governments, cities have to make decisions now and try to avoid making decisions that will cause problems in the future. Not just taking what we have now, but thinking strategically into the future. A place that is going to be afflicted by high temperatures in the future needs to avoid urban heat island effects. A harbor city might want to consider differently about what they're building at the edge of the sea or around canals. So not only did the city of Malmö permit old industrial land to be rebuilt with residences, and also that the SVT, the Swedish Public Broadcasting Services, made the decision of moving their facility in Malmö from a place far from the ocean to right by the ocean. Now we can see here that in this area, which used to be the old industrial harbor and so forth, the city of Malmö is permitting and actively encouraging the building of new residences. And we can see it's quite close to a lot of water. Now, we're not going to have flooding, presumably, in 10 years, but suppose some of the scenarios turn out to occur a bit faster than were originally anticipated. Not so smart doing all this. Not only that, think about all the money that has been, think about all the money that has been spent building up all this infrastructure, and all the property developers spending all this money. This tremendous waste in money that's going to occur. And yet, nobody's really up in arms about all this. Maybe because it's difficult to think sustainably long-term when it comes to climate. And in a country like Sweden, there seem to be a lot of people thinking that climate change isn't going to influence this impact of this country. It always happens someplace else. Look at the forest fires outside of Los Angeles. It's only going to happen, those kinds of things are going to happen there. And sea level rise is going to be a problem for Bangladesh and the Netherlands, but not here. Here can we see a television studio area in the city of Malmö for public broadcasting. Placing that facility right by all this water with the ocean or the sound towards Denmark right on the other side doesn't seem like it's such a good idea, and thinking about the future. Through the magic of video editing, we can see back in time to April 2023. The Red Bridge was not built yet. We're having an aerial view of the same location. In the upper left, we can see the SVT, the Public Broadcasting Company's location. Yeah, and we see the water beyond that, leading to the sound between Sweden and Denmark, an area where sea level will rise in the future. All this investment will start to have problems because of climate change. Seems like there are a lot of people that aren't thinking long-term enough, and they'll want to be bailed out and saved by the taxpayers in the future, one can assume. Couldn't somebody just make different decisions? The city could say, we're not going to build here. No, we can't do that. There must be some sort of pressure. Maybe Malmö isn't as environmentally sound as it tries to make itself to be. So what I'm trying to say is maybe Malmö has an environmental reputation, a city with an environmental reputation. Maybe it's not quite as deserved as it is. Oh, what a terrible thing for the media to say. How politically incorrect. So, thanks for watching. This was the second video presentation having to do with climate change and municipalities and local government. You're welcome to like and comment. If you missed the first video presentation, which had more to do with mitigation and also sort of introduced climate change and cities and so forth, then you're welcome to look at this video here again. If you've already seen that, then or if you've already seen that, then maybe you want to watch this one instead. Again, thanks for watching.